Good afternoon, and welcome to our New Directions in Conservation Psychology webinar. Today's topic is promoting practitioner well-being, practical strategies for coping with the emotional toll of conservation work. We're really glad you've joined us. Next slide, please, Thomas. Thomas Doherty, our speaker today, has a special history with Antioch University and with the Conservation Psychology Center. In addition to being an Antioch alum, Dr. Doherty earned his PsyD degree here. Thomas worked with Abby Abrash and Carol Saunders to start our Conservation Psychology Institutes and has been a regular faculty contributor to several institutes. Thomas is currently excited about a new Smart Cities and Health initiative he's leading, which focuses on how to develop new technologies to support well-being, equity, and sustainability in cities, including climate change resilience. We're delighted that he's able to share with us his work on eco-psychology and coping with the emotional toll of conservation work. Next slide, please. My name is Joy Ackerman, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. After introducing Thomas, he'll take over, and then at the end, I'll help direct your questions to him at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. A note on webinar logistics. If you're having any technical difficulties now or during the webinar, please use the chat function to send a message to Terry. She's our tech angel working behind the scenes to make sure that everything is accessible for you. We also ask that when you have questions about the content that you would like Thomas to address, use the Q&A section to note them. We'll be reading them as the presentation goes along, and at the end of the presentation, Thomas and I will draw from this question list to dive a bit deeper into the topics that you are most interested in. If you have difficulties during the webinar and get cut off, or if you need to leave, a link to the recording of this webinar will be sent out to everyone who registered. One reason I've enjoyed my career working in environmental studies and training is the passion and devotion my students bring to their learning and careers. In many ways, environmental and conservation work is a helping profession, engaging people who care and who want to make a difference. These mission-oriented and often problem-focused professions also engage us with uphill work and include exposure to crisis situations and news about losses and impending threats to humanity and nature on a broad scale, as well as to the specific communities and places we know and love. In order to maintain our capacity to do our work effectively and to support our colleagues in their work, it's important that we know how to care for ourselves. I appreciate the audience's acknowledgement of this need by your participation today, and I anticipate that you'll find effective tools and strategies in this presentation. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Thomas Doherty, who will address our topic for today.
All right, thank you very much, Joy, and I want to thank Joy and Antioch, New England, and the Conservation Psychology Program for inviting me. It's really great to be here, and I'm really impressed with the sign-ups. I know I see there's nearly 200 people that expressed interest in signing up for this talk, and some of those folks I do know, so hello to the folks that I know out there. I'm speaking to you from Portland, Oregon, where I live. It's a sunny morning here. Just got my daughter off to 6th grade. I'll be talking with you. I'll be going to drop off my taxes and seeing clients today. So this is just this is a day in the life for me. So I'm going to talk about well-being and coping broadly for environmental issues. Most of my comments will be focused directly on climate change because that's a fairly big thing that's up for people right now. And I will go through information. Some of this is academic information. Many of you are quite advanced and are experts in your own right, and so some of this will be review for you. But I'll also be sharing insights in how I actually work with individual clients in my psychology practice and how I've coped with some of these issues and how I've helped practitioners and activists cope. So we're going to be covering a lot of ground, and I'm looking forward to your questions as well. There's a number of references I'm drawing from. There's a lot of info on these slides. I'm assuming people will be able to look at the slides at their own time later, but there's just a number of references, interesting ones here, that most of all the references I'll cite in the talk are here on this list. I also have some additional references you can access later, some videos, some blog posts that I've written that are more plain language posts that help to explain some of these coping and nature connection ideas that I work with. I want to take a moment to remember Carol Saunders. I'm thinking of her today. Many of you know her. She's we call her one of the founders of conservation psychology. And we lost her this year to cancer. And, you know, I had met Carol early on when I was working on the Ecopsychology Journal. And she's a great example of an engaged scholar and an intellectual, but also someone who's quite open to ideas. And I was thinking about this Human Ecology Review issue, which is available online from 2003, which is still a great resource. And it's just, as someone who has edited an academic journal, it was really impressive to see someone pull together in one issue a whole, the birth of a new subfield. And as you all know, Carol and her colleagues at the time were looking at conservation biology and thinking about what would be a comparable approach from the psychology perspective. So that's thus the birth of conservation psychology. But just thinking of Carol today, I know she would have been here if she could. And let's move forward a little bit. Before I get into details, I want to talk about the process of talking about environmental issues. One of the big benefits, one of the gifts of psychology is understanding that, it's not just what we talk about, but how we talk about it and how we can coach people to get into an optimum place to talk about these quite frankly troubling and sometimes overwhelming issues. So I'm going to talk about this and provide some guidelines. Again, I'll let you look at these slides a little more later, but I just want to hit on some things that I think about when I'm working with groups, and I've done this hundreds of times now, and these are just some hard-learned lessons that I have. It's helpful to coach people regarding the ecological nature of these topics as we talk about our issues today with the environment or climate change. We'll remember the John Muir quote: when we pick on one thing by itself, we find it hitched to everything else. So it's quite common for these talks to jump to a number of different levels in terms of scale and also different topics. And that can be a little bit disorienting, but as a facilitator, you need to help guide people through that. Similar about the emotions. This is an emotional topic for people. It isn't simply intellectual. It's important to honor the loss, the deep sense of loss and concern that people have, particularly conservation professionals who are daily working in the field and really see the effects on other species, on the landscape, the effects of climate change. This isn't simply scientific and intellectual stuff. This hits us on a gut level. And it's also important to remember that when we're engaging in an emotional discussion, there's a lot of dynamics at play. When we're talking about positive emotions, people tend to be expansive and they tend to be creative. That's can be pleasurable. But when we get into the negative emotions, the concern, the fear, thinking can be constricted. People can get quite black and white in their thinking when they're stressed. And you all know this just from other times in your life you've been stressed. So this kind of thinking, these emotional dynamics will come and go, even in this talk today. Environmental issues are both complicated and complex. There's just a lot of details, a lot of expertise involved in understanding them, but they're also complex in the sense that these are wicked problems that are entwined with other issues and problems. So there isn't necessarily a solution to things, but we have to engage with them. And we also have to acknowledge that all environmental issues are ultimately social justice and equity issues. Environmental problems are not evenly distributed in the world, particularly any issues around technological disasters or issues tend to be visited on individuals of less wealth and privilege. So as soon as we get into this topic, we're going to be thinking about gender, we're going to be thinking about race, we're going to be thinking about politics and structural inequalities. That is intrinsic to this dialogue, and it's important to name that. And it's important to name, again, this is part of people's personal identity and their personal culture, whether their community culture or their indigenous culture, or their environmental identity, as I'll talk about. So we want to be thinking about multicultural competency and this idea of cultural humility. We have our own cultures, but we don't really understand necessarily where other people are coming from until we come into dialogue with them. Humility comes into play as well in terms of the limits of our expert knowledge. Even I know some of you are quite expert at various aspects of the environment or conservation or climate change, but we cannot know the whole. So it's important to try to avoid silo disputes between different experts. I often talk about the parable of the blind man and the elephant. Climate change, is it the trunk of the elephant? Is it the thick legs of the elephant? Is it the tail? Right? No, it's all of the above, right? And the emotions and the emotional impacts and the coping is also different. There are different ways that people are going to approach this. Mike Holm has a great book, Why We Disagree About Climate Change. Is helpful in looking really big picture on just the climate narratives that are prevalent in society. So we're going to be balancing in this talk both positive emotions and also honoring negative emotions and despair and grief. And I call this a dual process perspective, or a despair and empowerment curve. Different people are going to approach this differently, but we're going to try to honor both sides of that equation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my story with climate psychology. I was involved with the American Psych Association's Climate Task Force. And this is going back now to 2008, 2007, 2008, when I first got into understanding about climate change and doing some of the research in disaster psychology and things like that. And there was a number of important insights that I had then that are still really helpful, and I often talk about. I learned when I got into this that there are differences between natural and technological disasters in terms of how they're understood, how they affect people. A natural disaster such as an earthquake might not have any particular human cause. It's a larger geological, geophysical event. People tend to come together around natural disasters and help each other because there isn't necessarily a perpetrator involved. Technological disasters such as chemical spills or things like this, oil spills, they typically do have some sort of human error involved, possibly negligence, possibly a perpetrator. And so they tend to be more troubling to people. And those kind of disasters tend to divide people, particularly when certain groups are more or less impacted. And then, when I was reading about this years ago, they talked about the topic of a NATEC disaster, which is a combination of a technological disaster and a natural disaster. And when I first heard that term, 10 years ago, I thought that was kind of a science fiction-y kind of idea. But then very soon afterwards, we had the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico. We had the Fukushima, the tidal wave and the earthquake and the nuclear accident in Japan. And these are all combination technological and natural disasters. I was able to rethink Hurricane Katrina and realize that Hurricane Katrina wasn't just a natural disaster, it was also a technological disaster based on, the levees and the various human structures around New Orleans. And I also learned that there are different impacts with climate change. There is the disaster impacts that we all are clearly able to see, but there are also the rippling effects, economic effects, political effects, refugees and things like that, these broader psychosocial impacts. And then there's also the ambient impacts, just of taking it in, watching it from a distance, which really does take a toll. And I further learned that people, these events are mediated through the lenses that people look at things, the news that they watch, their level of education and things like that. And further on, they're buffered. People are buffered. Even in the same geographical location, a disaster is going to manifest differently for people based on their wealth, their structures around them, and things like that. So, and even people of the same socioeconomic class and the same community are going to have different psychological vulnerabilities. So there's quite a bit of diversity in this work. And that comes together in this kind of figure that we used in some of these early papers, where you could see that climate and weather at the top of the figure. Those are two different things. Weather is the daily events. Climate is over time. Weather is what you have in your banking account today. Climate is your overall budget over 2 or 3 years or your career, right? We have these different kinds of impacts: the direct impacts, the psychosocial impacts, the indirect impacts, the emotional impacts. And we can see they're mediated by various things, including how people access the media, which I'll talk about later. And then they're moderated by sources of vulnerability and resilience. So as you get into this, you can start to see there are ways to understand climate change, and there are ways to sort of see how things are happening. And years ago, the indirect impacts, that was seen as a little bit more speculative, grief and mourning about climate change, despair, depression, anxiety. That was seen as more, well, for special interests, for the environmentalists who are suffering, but not necessarily for the mainstream folk. But with recent events like storms on the East Coast, the fires in California, and various events around the world, this idea that climate impacts our mental health and emotions is gone quite mainstream, for better or for worse. And I get calls from reporters almost once a week these days, people wanting to talk to me about this kind of stuff. So this is in the zeitgeist now. Your average folk are aware of this kind of stuff. So I am going to talk about how people access the media here toward the end of my discussion here. And there's also much more research about the mental health impacts. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but it's really neat to see that people are studying this in a quite rigorous empirical way, looking at weather, looking at temperature, looking at the prevalence of distress and mental disorders. So the theory is being proven out through research, and it's going to continue to be so. Natural disasters, technological disasters, they do affect people's mental health. The weight and the stress of these things does affect people. And getting into the coping a little bit, one of the terms that I use is a climate hostage, is the idea that, well, I want to work on climate change. I see the issue, but I feel constrained. I don't see leadership, And so this is a psychological dimension of our time and place. We have the IPCC reports, and we know the stakes here, but there's still, as you all know, tons of political gridlock and backwards motion and propaganda and misinformation. So we need to move forward, but it is a difficult time. And so many people do feel sort of a hostage, and either literally or figuratively a hostage in this process sometime. So how do you cope? I'll give you a little insight into how I would work with a client that would come into my office coping with environmental issues or any other kind of issues in their life. Often when people come in to see me, they're like this person at the bottom of the diagram. They have limited resources, and these issues are really huge that they're coping with. If you're thinking about climate change, you can imagine this triangle here being as big as your house or as big as the sky, right? It's huge, right? And it's going to be quite overwhelming. So the reframe that we do initially here is just to, yes, you're overwhelmed. Let's do this reframe. Let's flip this around. Let's start working on your base. Let's either recover, rebuild, or discover your base, your own personal sustainability. How do we get sustainability working in your own life? Your foundation, rebuild your capacity to take on the big issues, right? This is not going to be new information for some of you, but it might be a good reminder, right? The idea is that if we can work on the base and build our capacity, build our resilience, we will have the energy to take on bigger projects, right? If we work out every day, or if we run every day, we will build capacity to run a 10K or a half marathon or something like that. So that's the general idea. And then, we talk about what are the person's daily acts. For most people, the beginning of the list is quite common: rest, diet, exercise, your family, your daily work, your friends, things like that. And then people have special projects they're working on, their hobbies, connection with nature, spirituality, their pets, getting outdoors, things like that. There's a number of daily acts that we all need to do to kind of stay healthy and be our best self. And then there's more frequent acts that we might do that not necessarily daily, but self-care acts that we're going to do pretty regularly. The idea is that we create a sense of momentum, of being grounded, a center of gravity, which then helps us to build capacity for big projects. At least this is how this works in my life. When I have a sense of momentum, I am not knocked off my feet when I hear some bad news, or when I'm confused for a moment. I know that I have a sense of things, a sense of momentum that's happening here. So there's a perceptual shift here that happens when we work on this kind of stuff. So this leads us into more coping discussions. I was thinking of Rachel Carson. She's a great example of someone who balanced grief and loss approaches. Silent Spring is a very powerful book if you've ever read it. It's a very powerful polemic, a political environmental polemic about um, chemicals and the environment and things like this. But she also wrote beautiful books about nature, the sea around us. She popularized nature writing for a whole generation of people, and she also wrote about the sense of wonder. So she really balanced what I would call despair and empowerment in a broaden and build, or a positive perspective. And as conservationists, we have the vulnerability of being in touch with nature and the natural world, and really seeing these problems firsthand and having some expert knowledge about the difficulties here. But we also do have the sense of getting out in nature potentially, and working with other species and seeing the beauty of the world and reclaiming that sense of wonder and seeing it in other people and seeing it in children. It really is important for our resilience. There's two broad traditions that I draw from, and some of this is from my eco-psychology work, and some of it is from my other psychology work. Joanna Macy is a well-known environmental philosopher, and for decades now, she's done grassroots kind of coping groups for people that are dealing with environmental issues. And I think her work exemplifies this kind of despair and empowerment perspective, where we go deep into the feelings. We don't shy away from the feelings of loss or despair. We go deep into those. We talk about those. We symbolize those. We share those, and we move through anger to reclaim the power that anger and fear and outrage gives to us. And that is, so it's a going deep to come out, right? And it's very helpful. And some people really gravitate to this kind of work. I was lucky enough to do a workshop with Joanna Macy years ago when I was younger, and it was really part of my environmental, awakening, my environmental identity to work with her. Another approach to this would be more of a positive approach. I think of Barbara Fredrickson, who's as a positive psychologist, a researcher, social psychology researcher. And she's popularized the idea of a broaden and build theory. Essentially means that as we build positive emotions, they tend to build on themselves. Positive emotions tend to build our physical health, our energy, our relationships, our creativity. And so we can, as like a stair step, we can use positive emotions to move upward. If I show people create positive or humorous or aesthetically pleasing images or videos, they will tend to be more creative. They'll tend to be more expansive, right? And so this leads us into the process of this work, because we do get excited about this. We get in the right place. We get around people that are gifted. We feel a sense of promise, and then that gives us this broaden and build. And then we get into what I would call the despair and empowerment curve, which is this idea that once we get into something, we realize, hey, this is more difficult than we thought. This is really problematic. This is confusing. This is, I'm not sure if I can really deal with this. And then we get into a despair curve. And there's some good research. This is a recent article on the despair and empowerment curve that, with education, which I like. But it kind of exemplifies this kind of despair curve when you look at any kind of difficult topics such as studying war or famine or disease, climate change, and things like that. If we don't help people to work with the emotions and give them an outlet, they can become quite discouraged and really kind of just stuck in a passive, despairing kind of way. So we need to name this process for people, because all of you who've done this for years know that you're going to be up and down on these kinds of things. So I think it is possible to help to engage people through the despair and bring them up to the broaden and build, right? And some of this is going to be the emotions. So I feel confused. I feel a sense of loss. I feel fear. This is not going to work. I'm going to be a failure. I'm concerned about the planet. I can't help, et cetera, et cetera. These are natural things that we all feel, and talking about them can help get them off of our chest. And we realize, well, if I was going to give advice to a friend, what would I tell them? I would help them to accept themselves and to be easy on themselves and to think about what daily activities they can do. So that gets us back to that pyramid that I was describing earlier. There's a lot of good work about ecological grief. If you're interested in this, that's been around for a while. There's a great article from almost a decade ago on working on climate grief from Rosemary Randall in the UK, which is quite appropriate today, where people will apply knowledge from grief theory in psychology and therapy to environmental losses, to climate change. And it's quite helpful. And we talk about the tasks, accepting the reality of the loss, working through the emotions, adjusting to the new norm, to the new environment, and ultimately reinvesting emotional energy into life, right? And we also talk about how we can get detoured on this path. So again, each person will have their own way of working through this, and it isn't easy, but it is possible to engage in this. A model that I like, another kind of dual process model, is the dual process model of coping and bereaving. Would say there's two things that are happening in loss and grief, right? There's the loss-oriented work and there's the restoration-oriented work. And these are two different tracks, right? It's not a black and white. It's not either you're on one end or the other. They operate simultaneously. So that's the insight about a dual process, right? There's two tracks happening. So what I'm talking about here is that we're going to be working on grief and loss simultaneously with broad and build and restoration. And at any given moment, our restoration energy may be high and our grief and loss energy may be low, or the reverse. Our grief energy may be high and our restoration energy may be low, right? But they're two different tracks, and they're both proceeding simultaneously. We're going to have these happening simultaneously as we work with issues like climate change. And you'll find yourself oscillating, as they say, between these, depending on what's happening in your life and your own mood and things like that. So balancing these two approaches, I think, is helpful. It helps us reach a larger group of people. You, yourself, myself, we'll gravitate to different types of approaches. Some people are more positive, broad build temperaments. Other people really do feel the need to get into the grief, right? So we want to be open. People, one of the insights of grief work is that people grieve in character, right? After a loss, people's characters emerge, and they will grieve in character. And so some people are much more matter of fact, more businesslike, more focusing on action. Let's work on the positive. Other people need to deal with the emotions. Some people have more complex and troubled processes. Other people have more smoother processes. Right. We also need to realize that it can be risky to share emotions in some contexts, particularly science contexts and things like that. So that's something we need to honor. When it comes to the environment, we have issues when we have issues, right? This is a statement I use with people. We have capital I issues, that things that we want to change in the world, but we also have our own personal stuff, our own personal issues, our own personal vulnerabilities. I can have both issues with the authority structures in the world, and I can have authority issues based on my background or my family or things like that. I mean, these are not mutually exclusive. So to the extent that I understand the lenses that I'm looking at the world through on any given day and how that comes from my own personal dynamics, I'm going to be much more effective and resilient and have much more insight. And I'm happy to talk about all this stuff in more detail, either in the dialogue or after this talk. Please do reach out to me. There are some self-help books that I like, that I use in counseling and psychology, that are very helpful also for environmental work. There's a book called The Upward Spiral that I really like. There's another book called Hardwiring Happiness. Both of these books use kind of brain science and neuropsychology to help people think about their emotions and their moods and things like that. The takeaway of the upward spiral is that when we're depressed or anxious, we get into a downward spiral. We start focusing on depressive and anxious imagery and narratives. We start remembering bad things from our past. We get a stress reaction in our body. We tend to get rigid in our thinking. We withdraw from positive things. We withdraw from doing healthy, restorative activities. We get isolated. We get more stressed. We get more ruminative. We look at the past, et cetera, et cetera. That draws us down into a negative spiral. Positive spiral is the opposite, where we get out of ourselves. We get out. We do activities. We think about something creative. We relax our body. We connect with people. That's the broaden and build kind of idea. Right? And Hardwiring Happiness, an insight from that book, is that we need to take in the good. We are wired to look for threats from an evolutionary perspective. That's helpful for us. So we need to work extra hard to take in the good, right? We need to note the good things, the beautiful things in the world, the relational things, the positive stuff, and we need to really take that in and amplify that and link these good feelings to overcome the biological tendency to focus on threats. Right. So this is another really fascinating conversation. Climate media, I want to touch on this. Again, I've been talking to a lot of media people lately here. Really troubling stuff on the news. That pyramid comes in handy. I think for some people, it's like all bad news all the time. And they don't have anything to draw on, and it can be really discouraging. So I like to think about reclaiming your nervous system. Focus on local things. Focus on your neighborhood. Focus on getting information from your natural environment, local knowledge. Think about climate change plans that your city might have. Think about community activities, right? Get a base. Read positive literature about nature and the environment. Read Rachel Carson, right? Rediscover your own, values. This gives us a center of gravity where we can take on the troubling news that is going to keep coming, right? I was just recently reading this book, Uninhabitable Earth. It's a great book about climate change, but it's just a really troubling book. And if I didn't have my own positive practices, it'd be difficult for me to read that kind of thing and take that in. So there's a paradox with climate action, doing things about the environment. What is enough, right? Again, I would say you're doing enough if you're going to the best of your abilities and trying to preserve your capacity for satisfaction, good relationships, and awe. That doesn't mean it happens all the time. You're going to be in the despair and empowerment curve. But if we lose that capacity for satisfaction and relationships and awe, if that goes zero, we're in trouble. We're going to get burned out. So it's really a process of doing the best we can and then taking care of ourselves in a personal sustainability perspective. So some self-reflection. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to keep moving forward here. If you know about conservation psychology and environmental psychology, there's good research and models to help understand how people think about nature and the natural world. Just briefly moving through this slide here, people have basic values, either earth-based values or helping people values or values about their own survival and family survival. People can develop an environmental worldview. If you see a consequence for something that you value, including yourself, and you have an ability to reduce the threat, you will have a sense of obligation to take an environmental act. And different environmental acts that people take include direct activism or citizenship, working within the system, or private sphere behaviors. So when I work with people, I help them to understand this and how this all plays out with them. This ability to reduce the threat is really key. And this is where people get troubled because they aren't sure what their ability is to take action. So they're kind of stymied in this sense of obligation, but not sure what to do. So this is where each person has their own individual story. It's really interesting stuff. And we have different kinds of environmental identity, right? There's different ways we think about nature and the natural world. That figure on the bottom is from Wes Schultz and his colleagues work around people's connectedness with nature. Some people see themselves as separate from nature. Other people see themselves as somewhat overlapped. And for some people on the bottom right, it's a sense of interbeing. Their self and nature is interbeing, right? And each of you have your own way of thinking about this as well. So honoring this helps us to think about how we cope, our environmental identity, and in turn, how we think about issues like climate change. So I hope this is giving you a lot of ideas and things are percolating for you all. So some questions to think about is, what is your go-to coping response? Are you more of a despair and empowerment person, or more of a broaden and build person? Or in your work setting, what is more helpful? Being with the health is a slogan I have when I'm working with clients. If you're concerned about an issue, that's healthy because it's normal to be concerned. It is healthy to be concerned about climate change, right? So we don't want to get stuck living in the concern. We want to come back to the center and say, hey, we're healthy. This is normal and healthy. If I'm lonely because I don't have a relationship, that's a normal response, right? Because that means I'm a healthy person. I want a relationship, right? So if I'm concerned about climate change, if I'm concerned about environmental stuff, if I'm concerned about these things, well, that's normal. That's quite healthy. So stay with the health. Stay with the health. And what is in your foundation? This is a little homework assignment for y'all to think about, what would be in your daily foundation and how you can, build or rebuild your capacity. So I'm gonna kind of open it up, try to keep a lot of time for questions and discussion, because I know this is a really rich topic for people. And so I'm going to open it up, and Joy, if you want to follow up with any follow-up questions you have yourself, or if you want to.
Sure, yeah. Thomas, thank you so much for this. So again, I encourage people to use the Q&A section in the webinar to just type in your questions so that we can see them. While people are thinking about questions, I guess, Thomas, I'd like to maybe benefit from your experience. We keep hearing that it's important to engage emotions, and yet those of us who are not professionals at dealing with emotions sometimes feel like it might be, we might do more harm than good. So, for example, one of the areas that I work in is the classroom, and I have students, and I know that I need to begin to engage them with their emotions. I'll tell you an interesting story. In addition to teaching conservation psychology, I teach a course in earth systems and climate change. And in that course, students break into groups and focus these global themes on the study of specific regions. And 2 years ago, one of those regions was the Arctic, where, of course, the climate change is now there and the effects are quite apparent. And one of the people in that group was from Alaska. And this group, in their final presentation, asked if they could, in addition to presenting the science, also engage the class in some work around the emotions, because they felt it was just too difficult to do the cognitive learning on this topic without having some ways to cope with the emotions. And I'm wondering if there are other science teachers among us, or other people that deal with climate change or biodiversity loss in sort of an educational setting, in a zoo or a museum or in the public sphere. Is there, is there a script, or is there a practice that we could move through without totally, upending the conversation with this? I'm a little afraid to open the lid because we might just all decide to, despair together and never move out of that. I guess it's almost like if I open this work, how do we then close it? And are there some guidelines or tips you have for people who are not psychologists to begin to integrate this with our work?
And did you want me to follow up on that, Joy? Or
yeah. I don't know if you'd like to share on that.
No, this is a great topic, and I am curious to see what tricks and practices that other people have. I mean, that's again why I talk about this despair and empowerment curve. And I think we need to also respect that our students are they're gifted, smart people, and I think giving them the tools and the information, we don't have to do the emotional work with them.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just naming that there's two tracks, naming that there's the despair track and the positive track, and just know that these dual processes. It's like a car that has a gas pedal and a brake pedal. There's two different things. If I disengage the brake, my car doesn't go anywhere, but I need to press the gas, right? It's a dual process. And so, one of the concrete things that I did when I've taught to undergrads is I said, this is troubling work, and I would name that early on. One of the students I had talked to years ago had a rainforest science professor, and his nickname was Dr. Doom, right? Because of how difficult the classes were and how troubling it was. But I would say for every hour you spend working on this troubling stuff, you need to get out in nature. You need to do recreational stuff. So it's I think it's in general coaching about resilience and coaching about avoiding burnout. That is a message that does not get anyone who's done a doctoral program will identify with this. I mean, that's not what you hear about, right? But when I started my doctoral program in Antioch, one of my teachers said, this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? And you're going to be in this for the long haul. And I remember that kind of thing. And so I think just coaching students, And it's going to be okay. I think the sense that you'll never come out of the despair is kind of an illusion. As people get stressed, their bandwidth lessens. They get tunnel vision, right? And we get really black and white, and we think it's always going to be a certain way. But the reality is, if you've ever done mindfulness meditation, our minds are changing all the time. And so we just need to stay present, and things will evolve. And the students themselves will do this empowerment. One of my techniques, I call it what would you tell a best friend in the same situation technique, right? If you take your situation, imagine a friend, what advice would you give them? That quickly is a little mental judo, right? Where we get out of the amygdala and our fear response, and we get creative. And well, I tell a friend, take your time, or get some rest, or drink some water, or you're doing a good job. And that's all coming from inside us, right? We need to take that energy and put it back into us. And students can do this kind of thing. Students know how to do this, and so I think this can be modeled in a classroom. But anyway, yeah. But I'd be happy to hear what other people have to say about this. But I should step back and say it's an ethical duty to help students deal with this.
Yes, yeah, I agree with that.
It's ethical duty to help them, to give them some tools, or don't do the work because otherwise you're going to turn these students off.
Okay, so let's move on to some of the participant questions. I want to ask those who are typing their questions in the chat, perhaps you could retype them in the Q&A area. And then Jennifer's asking if you could show the slide reframing, building the foundation. So I think, Thomas, you're in charge of your slides, and do you know which one that one is?
Yeah, I am trying to get back to that. There's a few different ones here. I basically did this sort of sequence where people feel overwhelmed, and we do this reframe, simple reframe. You can draw this out on a whiteboard, right? Is what I would typically do, and we just introduce that foundational idea, and this bricks sort of in the foundation. And then we can get into some details, and people will take this in different directions. But again, I would think about the daily acts, and then in terms of self-care, the frequent acts. You might not get out into the woods or go camping or hiking every day, but you might try to do that frequently, right? Or connect with certain people or certain hobbies, or things like that. But it's that center of momentum. If you're riding a snowboard, or you're trying to ride a bicycle or something, having a momentum keeps us balanced, keeps us dynamic. So this is what I'm talking about here, building a sense of momentum. And also, rest. Despair is fatigue in disguise. So if we're fatigued, we're more vulnerable to feeling down, to losing our momentum.
Yeah, and I find the image of these reversing triangles itself, it's easy to remember, but it's also really shifts your sense of what's resting on you and what you're resting on. That's great.
Yeah.
So we have about 8 questions up now. I don't know if you have your Q&A box open too. I can start to read them, but if you want to look at them, that's fine. And if you don't, that's fine too.
Yeah, I just opened it up here, and I'm coming back up in here. There's a number of juicy ones. Joy, why don't you just direct them to me? That way I can make
sure. Yeah, happy to do that. So, Catherine's talking about this strategy of avoidance. If I don't learn about nature, if I don't care about nature, it will somehow protect me if the things in nature that I love disappear.
Yeah. Well, I just, I want to honor that, Catherine. I mean, I just think that's very well put. It's just before we even go into problem solving, I think the coping is just to name the truth of these things. I've experienced things like this as well. You might in this case do. There's so much work out there, but people have done interesting work. You might think about what the environment wants from you, what the landscape wants, does the landscape want you to avoid it? When I've done some wilderness therapy trainings with students, we've done exercises, where we'll go into a natural place, and we'll stand in a circle, and we'll just walk outward, and we'll ask permission to enter the space. in a more indigenous kind of sense. We'll just ask permission of the space to enter it, and we come into a dialogue with the space. And that's kind of an interesting reframe too. Because I do think, yes, your personal ego is trying to soften the blow, but the environment out there doesn't want you to doesn't want you to go away. It's part of you, right? So there's a sort of a philosophical thing here where we are not separate from the nature of the natural world, and you really can't avoid it, because then all you're doing is going internal, right? So there really isn't an avoidance. So I think any practice that you can do to start walking, move forward, get into the environment, use your senses, engage your senses, disengage your intellect for a little bit, you might find that you'll that's that sense of wonder, or you might just bring a 6-year-old with you, or a 10-year-old, and just follow them, right? Because they're going to be coming at the world from a different sensibility. So I think there are certain ways to sort of get over this hump, but some techniques like that. Good luck.
Yeah, and I think there is that element of mindfulness, of being present in the moment. And if there's beauty here now, we're really doing a disservice to ourselves to not appreciate that. But I know what it's like to be distracted by future scenarios and miss the present entirely. One of our attendees asked particularly about teens who are becoming a powerful voice in the climate change movement, and wondering if there are any particular considerations that need to be addressed when working with young people, because they're just coming to understand themselves and their personal power and their role in society.
Yeah, this is great, and I think about this a lot, and I think about the teens that are. I got to help out with this U.S. versus Juliana, this lawsuit that young people are bringing against the U.S. Government regarding climate change, and I'm really supportive of that. There's a whole nother conversation we can have about development. Another Antioch person is David Sobel, who's written really good work on environmental education, developmentally appropriate environmental education. And the simple idea of that is that each sort of developmental stage has its own way to connect with the environment. If you think about classic stages of development, so young children, infants, toddlers are very much involved with their senses and just touching things and being there. And then, as children get older, they start to develop more concrete abilities to play and to take action, and they're much more magical in their thinking. So they do a lot of make-believe. So it's easier to teach young children about bird species by having them dress up as birds and pretend they're the birds than to give them intellectual information about the birds, right? And then as we get into more middle childhood, it's concrete things. It's learning skills like building forts and climbing trees and doing outdoor stuff, right? And learning how to camp and learning about nature, doing field work, doing science projects and things like that. And then in adolescence, we get into abstract thinking and the ability to look at the world and think about systems and politics and things like that. But an insight here that's helpful to teens and to adults is that those earlier stages don't go away, right? We don't just abandon the earlier stages and just become these intellectual machines as adults, right? We need to have our senses engaged. We need to have our imaginations engaged. We need to have concrete skills in the outdoors, like hobbies or ability to do things, hands-on things. That provides the base where we can take on the abstract ideas. So as teens are taking on the abstract stuff, we don't want them to lose their childhoods, right? That's the danger, I think, with teens. Is they lose their childhood and they just become despairing. They lose their sensibility, or they realize they never had one, right? And then they need to rebuild it. And even with adults, if you didn't have a good, I saw Louise Chalo was one of the people that was signed up for the call, and she's a great, person that's been an expert on children and nature and things like that. If you did not have, an adult mentor as a child to lead you through in some classic sort of naturalist training, that doesn't mean you can't pick that up as an adult, right? You can still do that. So I think with teens, being aware of the developmental stages and giving them support so they can be healthy adults is an interesting way to approach that, if that makes sense.
That's really great, Thomas. I like that idea of kind of one, if you didn't have a childhood in nature, it's not too late to have it now. And sounds like a great idea for people that are working with adults in nature, and good for our own personal practices too. Someone from Denver Zoo Field Conservation asked about integrating the emotional work of conservation not just into our own personal practice, but into our organizational program development.
Yeah, no, that's a great question too. And that's a little bit challenging because, again, the zoo person or the scientist might not be trained in necessarily in group facilitation or things like that. So a practical thing you might do is partner with someone, a consultant or a local, psychologist or someone that can come in and do this work. So you don't have to do it yourself. They can bring in the expertise and the sort of risk management skills and things like that. So that's a kind of a practical way to do this in terms of like a workshop or something like that. But I think just again giving people information again around the despair and empowerment, or that despair and empowerment curve, I think very much is a part of program development and program dynamics, right? As we start a program, we might start with that sense of possibility and interest, and as we wade into things and the interpersonal stuff, we can get into a bit of a little bit of a pit there, and there's some good group process, old time group process things, storming, norming, forming, these different stages of organizational group development that do work on this a little bit. So that's just some general ideas, but whoever you are at Denver, I'd be happy to talk with you a little more about this, because I think it's possible. And then each organization is going to have a separate culture and a separate history, and you're going to want to you don't want to you want to do something kind of a bit customized for each place. It's not rocket science, but it is helpful to think about the culture and the style there, and then approach emotions through that way. You might need to come through the science side first to make sure everybody really is on board, or you might need to come from a grassroots direction if that's more appropriate. So there's some strategies, I think, to get to that place.
Great, thank you for that. And somebody asked more specifically if there are good resources or authors in regard to the despair empowerment curve. This is another zoo practitioner who's working with a local high school on a conservation leadership course, and would like the instructors to be able to recognize this pattern in the students they're working with. So I guess if there are maybe they're already in your resource list, or maybe there's some other things you can suggest.
Well, I think a good place would be this article, the Maguth and et al. Article. It's just because that's just current. I think that's just this year, and it's in my resource list, and so that reference list would be a good place. And they also reference a work from Berman, where he kind of popularized this despair empowerment curve, and it's actually from a textbook that came out in 1990 on teaching. I don't remember the title. It was about teaching social justice topics in schools. So again, people have been working on this for years, but I think that Berman essay and that particular book would be a great resource, and then that article will probably be something that's more current.
All right, great, thank you. So someone picked up on the discussion we had at the beginning of the Q&A on the ethical duty that we have to help students, and how might that extend to situations where you're working with an audience that comes and goes, like zoo visitors?
That's a good one too. Let me think about that for 1 second here. Well, yeah, the short answer is yes. I think we have an ethical duty to the public and to our zoo visitors, just in the same way. Now, we don't have we don't have as much time. And then with the zoo folks, we're gonna have to work more on things like the messaging, the signage, and things like that. So we're gonna have to catch, we're gonna have to work it into our interpretation, basically. And I've seen some pretty good stuff, at least at some of the zoos that I've been to, like the Portland Zoo. I think that the thing that my insight, that I learned in working in conservation psychology and conservation biology is I got over my old idea as zoos being sort of, prisons for animals to really being, conservation centers that are part of a global network of species conservation. And that insight, I think, is so important for the public to get. And I don't think everyone gets that from a zoo. And I think that bigger message that all these zoos and all these folks that work there are connected all around the world, and that are essentially keeping some species alive. And this network, that's very powerful and enlightening. So I would think, getting at that bigger message would be helpful. But again, you're going to have to, make sure your signage and your sort of interpretation has examples of positive things. So you norm people toward the positive things that are happening, not toward the negative things. We want them to see that. So that's what they identify with. Another good conversation to keep following up on.
Yeah, so I'm hearing that pattern of bringing in the positive. I know we've been accused as environmentalists of also being doomsayers, and maybe just starting with the positive, and as we work through the bad news, maybe remembering to end on a good note, or engaging people in thinking about something positive, or maybe emphasizing the difference that we can make. Someone asks about research that might be available on psychological impacts for teens or younger kids from imagining their future in connection to climate change, and what that's doing to them emotionally.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a good. I'd have to get online and look up that a little bit, but that's a big piece of this work right now. I know one of the writers I talked to, Britt Ray, she might be on this call. I know she's working around young people, and what didn't come up today, which is another very powerful idea, is this idea of people having. People deciding whether they want to have children or not. I know that's an issue that she's working on. People that are concerned about the environment and climate change, and it's affecting their life decisions. So I don't, unfortunately, have a good go-to resource for that. But I'm sure that I know that there are people studying that, and that has been studied for a while. So if that person wants to send me a note, I would be happy to help follow up on that. And I do have my contact information here at the end. Any of you all, if you want to consult, you have questions, you want to collaborate, I'm always looking for collaborators. Please give me a shout by email or phone. Indeed.
All right, thanks. So we just got a few minutes left. I note that Hannah Petrie, who's one of our Conservation Psychology Institute grads and is at St. Louis Zoo, is saying that they strive for hopeful messages with both their zoo visitors and with their staff and in their department. So that's great to hear. There's a doctoral student in the Environmental Studies Department who's studying conservation psychology, who wants to know how to get more involved in doing eco-psychology research without formal training in clinical psychology.
Yeah, that's a great question too. The Eco-Psychology Journal is a great resource. Peter Kahn is the current editor. That was the publication that I helped to get off the ground. And that's a great outlet in the sense of you're not required to have a clinical psychology background to publish in that area. And there's Peter Kahn and Patricia Hasbach have recent some edited volumes on eco-psychology that are really helpful too. The key with eco-psychology is to realize that is a very interdisciplinary or what I would call transdisciplinary area, in the sense that it doesn't really have a very strong academic home, in the sense that it's pulling from different different perspectives. And so it tends to fall in the cracks between environmental psychology, environmental studies, and clinical psychology. So you just have to be prepared that you need to be a self-starter when you're doing that kind of work, because it is truly interdisciplinary. And when I say transdisciplinary, I mean it goes outside of the disciplines, and it even questions the disciplines, right? It's critical of the disciplines. And so you have to understand a little bit of the politics of that, and the kind of the psychology of that. And the key for eco-psychology research is to be able to understand a bit of the science and to frame your broader philosophical questions in a scientific language to get your foot in the door. So I might want to study how to empower students to overturn the capitalist system and create an ecological global system, right? Something really ambitious. But I might break that down into more operationalized things. Like I might say, what political education helps students become more empowered in their local communities to take action on community committees, say, or something like that. So you need to be able to translate these eco-psychology ideas into some actionable things, and then people will be interested. So that's a little bit of coaching that I give to students, a little example coaching I give to students.
That's great, thanks. So we're going to wrap up, but I'm hoping we can end on a positive note. There are a number of people who have written in who feel overwhelmed, who find that when they go out in nature, they're just seeing the destruction. And so they're finding it difficult to go out in nature and get that rejuvenation. And others that are interested in a technique or two to halt that downward spiral. Any parting assignment for us?
Yeah, I mean, I try to stay active with new projects. As you noted earlier, I'm doing this Smart Cities and Technology project, which doesn't sound very nature based, but the big part of that is actually keeping nature and connection to nature as part of these technological smart cities. So it's bringing together, people that are doing green spaces and trails, along with the folks that are thinking about technology and city planning. So it really, it's that momentum, but there's a spectrum of nature from inside to outdoors. So plants, pets, our gardens, our local parks, getting out to forests and the riverside or ocean shore and out into wilderness. And there's a great, I can send it to someone if they like, but there's a kind of a nature pyramid that someone has created, like the old style food pyramid. And it has, again, daily kind of nature connections, and then more frequent. And then at the apex is these, once in a lifetime kind of things, like going to the Grand Canyon. So work on your nature pyramid, little things at the base and then occasional things. That's a way to sort of get at this. And it could just be your pet. It could taking kids out in nature. It could be working in your garden, watching a sunrise and a sunset. Those are some, it's reclaiming the mundane, the little things mean a lot. So that's where I would start with that again, but I'd be happy to consult with people if they want to reach out to me.
That's wonderful. I love the idea of a nature pyramid. I think maybe I'll put that on my refrigerator.
Yes.
So Thomas, thanks again for being with us today and sharing with us these tools and strategies for well-being. It's always a pleasure to work with you, and I always learn so much. And I really appreciate you sharing your contact information so folks can reach out to you for additional support and consulting and questions. Could you advance to the next slide so I can let folks know about our backup one? First, we want to remind people to,
Sorry.
Oops, that's okay. We want to remind people to take a few moments to fill out the survey about today's webinar. We really appreciate your feedback, and we do use it to improve both our specific presentations before we present them again, and to improve our overall program. So you'll receive an email in about a week with a link to a recording of today's webinar and a PDF of today's slides. And Thomas, if there are any additional resources, the pyramid, or any other references that you'd like us to send out with that email, you can send them to Terry. That would be terrific. And our final slide, this is our last webinar in the 2018-2019 academic year. But we hope that you'll stay connected with us to find news as the webinar series resumes next year. We'll hope that you also take a moment to look at the registration page for our upcoming Conservation Psychology Institute. This will give you some more idea of what is involved in coming to an institute. If your organization is interested in sending a team, or if your organization is interested in hosting a future institute, you can contact us through the Conservation Psychology website here at Antioch University, New England in Keene, New Hampshire. So thank you very much, Thomas, and everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Joy. Thank you very much.